Hi everyone, it's Jocelyn at Red Balloon Cards. Today I'm participating in a blog hop for the sweet and super talented Emily Leiphart. Emily's celebrating her 100th video, woohoo! And we're having a hop to celebrate. For the hop, I made a card using the technique of whitewashing a background, and this technique really adds fantastic depth to a card, and the softness is just so pretty. So I used Altenews Lacy Scroll stamps for most of the stamping on this card. I'm starting with the stamp background, and I use the largest floral stamp, and I'm going to stamp it in 4 different colors. So I'm using fresh inks for my card, and I love how these pigment inks layer. I decided to start with the darkest color, which in this case is fuchsia. And just remember when you're doing this technique that the flowers don't have to be perfect. I mean, it is going to get covered up, so it really doesn't matter if it's a little bit splotchy. Next, I'm moving on to the pool color, and I'm going to stamp and layer this over the first stamps. And I should mention that because I'm stamping over a darker color, I need to clean it every time. Otherwise, I might transfer the ink onto the pad. If you've ever done that before, it's just the worst. I went ahead and stamped the same flower in 2 other colors, sugar and lemonade, as you'll see here. Okay, now on to the whitewashing. For this step, I need 2 brushes with stiffer brushes, so no watercolor brushes. And I'm using a barely damp brush. You don't want a wet brush or the paper will warp too much. For the whitewash, it's just white flat paint from Hobby Lobby and a couple of drops of water. I mix those together in my palette and then I brush it onto the card. Now, since the brush marks will show, it's kind of important that I brush up and down in the same pattern. I don't want to have circles or smiley faces. I just want to make sure that the grain of the brush marks are the same. While the paint is wet, I'm going over the card a second time, and then I'm going to let it dry. And I should point out that while this might look like I'm just making a white card, once it dries, it does dry a little bit lighter and a little more translucent. So it's not going to end up being completely white. Once I've let the first coat dry, I'm going to repeat the process. Now this time I'm using a dry brush and it's a bit stiffer than the first one. If you like the look after one coat, then just go with it. There's no reason why you have to do the second coat. And I should say too, if your paint is too thick on a card, just add a little bit of water and push the paint onto your scrap paper. I'm going to go ahead and let this card dry for a bit. Now that the second coat is dry, I'm going to stamp over the background with some light inks. So first I'm using the fresh ink sugar, and I'm using the same Lacy Scrolls flower that I used for the background. My goal in this step is to add some stamping, but I'm not looking for perfect stamping. Since the background is kind of rustic, I just want the stamping on top to be a bit rustic too. So if it's not perfect, that's okay. Now for the flowers, I don't have a particular pattern, I'm just adding some depth. I'm using the same Altenews set and I'm adding a leaf and a scroll to the background. I'll use the chamomile fresh ink to stamp the leaf. Man, looking at this inking, I really need to re-ink this ink pad. Well, fortunately, it's exactly the look I'm going for. I'll stamp a few of the leaves, and although this time I'm stamping more on the diagonal. I decided that I needed to stamp the leaf in sugar just to fill in that upper corner. I'm liking how the background is looking, but I decided that I need to add a little more color to it. So I'm going to use the lemonade fresh ink and I'm going to use the scroll from the Altenews set. Now this ink is quite a lot bolder and brighter than the other colors, but I wanted to use something bolder to create a focal point. I'm going to be having a cluster of flowers and I wanted to draw attention to that area. Again, I'm just stamping a few on the diagonal. Like I said, I'm going to be adding a cluster of flowers. And since the background isn't bright white, I decided to use PTI's linen vellum. I just love this cardstock. It has some translucency, but not as much as regular vellum. I'm stamping the same large flower in sugar and fuchsia inks. Now the sugar is very light, but it adds just a really pretty lightness to the card. I've also noticed that the dye ink doesn't work that well on this cardstock, but this pigment ink works very well. I do set it with a heat gun though. Now my fussy cutting is slow, so I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera. For the sentiment, I'm using Altenews Figure Effects set and the You Are My Sunshine stamp. I could have stamped directly on the background, but I wanted the sentiment to stand out on the white cardstock. Now the fonts on this set are just awesome. I'm getting ready to machine stitch the sentiment strip, but I want to determine the placement first. I decide to wrap some cord around the panel just a couple of times. I've got the sentiment stitched on, and now it's time to adhere the flowers. I'm using 2 glue dots and I'm layering them on top of each other. It's just adding a bit of dimension with the extra glue dot, and I'm also going to use some vellum tape to make sure it sticks. For the fuchsia flower, I put on a 3D Zot glue dot onto the first flower. Now the 3D dot doesn't seem to show through on the vellum. I decide to add a white transparency butterfly from Maya Robe, and I use the same vellum tape and tuck it underneath the flower. My card is just about done, but one technique I like to do is to lift the edges of the card. I simply go around the edges and bend them back and forth gently. Now, not too hard, it will crease. I like the dimension that it adds. Yay, it's a finished card! Now, if you try this whitewash background, be sure to leave me a note in the comments. And also, leave a note for a chance to win prizes from the really great sponsors. Thanks so much for stopping by. Have a great day.